COVID has obviously shone a light on some of the existing inequalities in relation to how people from particular communities are impacted, and in relation to older people and disabled people in particular.
BME people, women, and there have been concerns about the gender pay gap. Pregnant workers and mothers, people in care homes, learning disabilities.
Women with other protected characteristics.
The LGBT community, young working class boys, young working class children, children with special educational needs and disabilities, and disabled children more generally. And forgive me for not name checking BME school children in particular, but I certainly did intend, for them to be included in the groups that I was talking about. These are communities that are already struggling, and COVID has made their support particularly worsen. So by ring fencing money and by overseeing the provision and a commitment to that continuation is absolutely vital to protect these people who don't like to be called vulnerable for very important reasons, but actually who are valid recipients of our support and of the money that we as a state contribute to look after everybody.
So this is the third in the series following the progress of Parliament's Women Equaliites Committee and their inquiry into the unequal impacts of COVID-19 on people with characteristics protected under the Equality Act 2010. I believe that this committee have an important role to play in helping to highlight some of the structural and attitudinal barriers that people can come across when attempting to address male inequalities and champion the human rights of boys and men. And in this video, I'll be focusing on the evidence session involving the watchdog, enforcer and gatekeeper of those equality-related protections, the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And I also want to take a closer look at the personal and political priorities of the recently appointed chair of the Women Equalities Committee, the Conservative MP for Romsey and Southampton North, Caroline Noakes. Now, as you may expect, there was a lot of ground to cover over the roughly 2-hour meeting. So in order to keep this analysis reasonably succinct, I'm mainly going to focus on what I would describe as 2 critical incidents that I believe help to highlight significant structural and attitudinal factors that have negative implications for a whole range of protected groups. As usual, I'll upload a copy of the full 2-hour meeting to my B-side channel, and I'll also include timestamps for a few other significant sections. Significant sections such as the relatively predictable response to this predictably gendered question.
We know that the majority of victims of domestic violence are women. We have seen reports of increases of that during the current period of lockdown. What evidence, if any, is there available to you of women with other protected characteristics being increasingly or suffering to a greater extent as a result of COVID-19?
So, for the uninitiated, the EHRC are a statutory non-departmental public body. They're funded by the government but operate independently of it and are recognised as an expert and authority on equality and human rights law. Most relevant to this inquiry is their responsibility to promote and enforce everybody's right to equality before the law as enshrined by the Equality Act 2010. Rights which are very much set out in the context of equality of opportunity for all and protection from discrimination, either directly or indirectly, because of a specific protected characteristic. They also have a statutory duty to produce regular reports to Parliament on how fair life is for everyone in Britain and how far everyone in Britain is able to live free from discrimination and human rights abuse. And as their most recent State of the Nation report in 2018 helps to highlight, This involves passing comment on the altogether more complicated matter of how to address equality or inequality of outcome in all sorts of different areas for all sorts of different groups. And as you can imagine, the concept of inequality of outcome significantly informed a discussion on the unequal impact of COVID-19. And inevitably, from the outset, the chair of the committee and their expert witnesses were very keen to mention one particularly pressing concern.
I think it's really obvious over the course of the last couple of months that we have seen challenges around the unequal impact of COVID that perhaps couldn't have been predicted at the start, but are now certainly very, very apparent. And I would highlight in particular the unequal impact on people from Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities.
I think what is needed is a really comprehensive and joined up approach. And then coming out of that, a really comprehensive and joined up cross-government strategy to actually address the factors that are contributing to these disparities.
And Chair, can I just add to what Melanie has said, please?
Go ahead, David.
Oh, yes. Belle, I was just keen to take the opportunity to say, obviously, we share your real concern and the concern of the BAME community and their allies in relation to the severity of the impact of the virus on the BAME community as well as other communities. And we understand the real anxieties that exist. And building upon what Melanie was saying, we're really keen to play our part. I mean, this is a wake-up moment in relation to the severity of the issues affecting BME communities. And we do need a coherent way forward, which actually COVID presents an opportunity as well as a disaster. The opportunity of COVID now gives us, and we want to play our part along with our partners and with parliamentarians in delivering that.
Now, in fairness to our expert witnesses, advising on and agreeing appropriate actions aimed at addressing inequality of outcome can be a complex, confusing and sometimes controversial affair, probably not entirely dissimilar to herding cats, only with the added complexity of ensuring that no actions aimed at addressing perceived unfairness turn out to be directly or indirectly unfair on any particular people from any particular protected group, including people from the protected group that any proposed positive action is intended to support or shield in the case of the following proposal.
You'll see that the government have taken the time, obviously and rightly so, to shield particular the people with protected characteristics. So we know that people with diabetes are 3.5 times more likely to die from a COVID-19 related death, and they would come under a disability, and so they're being shielded. But with BAME people having being up to 4 times more likely, even when you, and 2.5 times more likely when you remove those their underlying health conditions. Do you think that at this moment in time, the government should be looking towards more shielding measures and, putting them on parity with some of the other individuals they're protecting in particular?
I think the problem is that it's really too early to say what the factors are. We know that comorbidities may be a factor. We know that socio-economic issues and housing conditions may be a factor. We know that the places where BAME people are disproportionately employed may be a factor. So there's a whole range of issues around exposure and susceptibility that we really need to unpack. And I think, there'd be concerns about kind of blanket measures applied that restrict the freedoms of a sector of the community without them being properly evidence-based.
In other words, it's one thing to signal that all Black lives matter, but it may not be the best idea to put all Black people under extended house arrest. And by the way, if you were wondering who those
other communities
adversely impacted by exposure to the disease COVID-19. They are older people, people with disabilities, people from lower socioeconomic status, people working in certain occupations, people living in urban areas, and people who are men. Now, it will probably come as very little surprise to regular viewers of The Glass Blind Spot that men were mentioned a grand total of 1 time throughout the entire 2-hour evidence session. And setting aside any possibility of conscious or unconscious bias, I'd now like to propose one relatively obvious reason as to why that might be. And to do that most effectively, I want to play the first of 2 excerpts from the session that, in my humble subjective opinion, most effectively highlight evidence of structural and attitudinal factors that have negative implications for all sorts of people from all sorts of protected groups.
And has the Everyone In campaign been successful?
So we think it has, that it's to be welcome, but I think the question is what happens when that comes to an end. Yeah.
Sorry, and has the government provided sufficient guidance for hostels and day centres? Is that something that you know?
It's not something that we've particularly looked at, I'm afraid.
Okay, and on your assessment then, has the data reported of the number of homeless people being given accommodation been accurate?
I have no reason to think that it's not accurate, but again, it's not something that we've specifically been focusing work on.
Chair.
Thank you, Sarah. Can I follow up, Melanie, on the issue of the Everyone In campaign and those who perhaps might remain excluded from that? And whilst I know that many local authorities have worked incredibly hard to bring as many people into emergency and temporary accommodation as possible, certainly anecdotally, it is the case that those with mental health conditions, and we know that street homeless people often have multiple vulnerabilities, but those particularly with mental health conditions have found it harder to access hotel accommodation. Do you have any evidence around numbers of that and whether those with mental health conditions are receiving the parity that they should do?
I don't have any information about that, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll briefly pause there to clarify that the Everyone In campaign was a government initiative launched at the end of March, where local authorities were provided with emergency funding to house all rough sleepers and those sleeping in homeless hostels or night shelters, quite literally by the following week. At the time, the chief executive of the homeless charity Crisis described it as a landmark moment, observing that the government has committed to ending rough sleeping by 2025, and this proves that it can be done in 2020 if we make it the priority it deserves to be. And in all fairness to the EHRC's expert witness, not only did questions about the scheme come near the end of a gruelling 2-hour session, and a discussion that covered, amongst other things, equality monitoring, equality impact assessments, education, local authority duties, health and safety at work, pregnancy and maternity discrimination, gender pay gap reporting, child poverty, health inequalities, gig economy workers, furloughed employees, universal credit, the order in which industry should reopen from lockdown, policing during lockdown, hate crime, food banks, accessible shopping, and the relatively unequal impact of COVID-19 on people from the black and minority ethnic and LGBT communities, care leavers, looked after children, Roma and Irish travellers, older people, younger people, people with a disability, women, and, very briefly, young working class boys. But as we are about to learn, there is a specific reason why our expert witness struggled to answer 3 questions concerning one of the most disadvantaged groups of people in society. The sort of people that in more normal times, many of us have become accustomed to walking past on our pavements as we rush about our day.
Can I bring in Kim Johnson, please?
Chair, could I just make a particular point about the breadth of our work, and Melanie referred to it. We've obviously had to try and prioritise our particular responses, not just during COVID, but more generally, because clearly there's a lot that we could do. And our board, having liaised with our stakeholders, have worked out a clear set of priorities, which is part of our business plan. We've adapted that really quite quickly to respond to COVID. And I was really keen just to reinforce that on the homelessness point and housing more generally, it's not because we consider the issues to be unimportant or insignificant. It's just that due to our resources and the fact that we as an organisation is similarly challenged by working remotely during COVID, we've alighted on priorities which really focus on much, but not everything that we've talked about today.
So in other words, the EHRC are expected to be and do a lot of things for a lot of people. And in all fairness, they can't be expected to meet every single expectation or prioritise every single concern. And so consequently, after close consultation with their various stakeholders, rough sleepers didn't quite make it on their priority list of things to do. Highly influential and often well-resourced stakeholders, of which very few exist to lobby specifically on behalf of the interests and concerns of boys and men. Certainly when compared to special interest groups lobbying on behalf of people from other genders or sex. Which I guess goes some way to explaining why both women and transgender people are mentioned in the EHRC's reasonably lengthy list of people disproportionately affected by homelessness, a reasonably lengthy list that surprisingly doesn't mention men. This despite the fact that 84% of rough sleepers in London, where the EHRC are based, are male, as are 90% of the people who die while rough sleeping throughout England every year. And this significant status of some stakeholders is also probably why so much time was given over to concern that people from minority ethnic backgrounds are dying at disproportionate rates compared to people who are white. Well, the fact that 60% of all fatalities have been people who are male didn't so much as get a mention. Neither did the fact that 70% of ICU submissions and 75% of ICU deaths have been male, or that people who are men of working age are twice as likely to die as their female peers. Not during the meeting or in any of the COVID-19 briefings available on the EHRC website, including the ones submitted to the committee in advance of the meeting. It is hard to imagine this happening if the gendered impact had been the other way around, especially when you consider that for the second time in 3 meetings, a not insignificant amount of time was set aside to discuss how much every single woman in Britain earns when directly compared to every single man. So I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that the majority of gender champions and stakeholders who help shape the Commission's priority business will have a disproportionate impact on how we view matters of inequality. For example, men are significantly more likely than women to be a victim of violent crime, and yet when it comes to inequalities in criminal justice, the EHRC has only ever concerned itself with violence against women and girls. In education, there's been a significant focus on measures aimed at addressing the underrepresentation of women in STEM, and yet no comparative efforts to address similar levels of male underrepresentation in occupations such as teaching, health and social care. In employment, gendered trends relating to health and safety and workplace fatalities rarely make it to the priority list. At least until very recently, when public concern has suddenly focused on the overrepresentation of women in frontline occupations, such as teaching, health and social care. 95% of the prison population are male, and yet when the Commission raised significant equality-related concerns around the risk of COVID-19 outbreaks in prisons, these concerns were framed solely in the context of the disproportionate impact on people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And significantly, Britain's representative on a worldwide group of esteemed human rights institutions holds 2 distinctly different positions when it comes to the non-therapeutic cutting of children's genitals, very much depending on their sex. All of which brings me to the one actual mention of men throughout the entire 2-hour meeting.
Thanks, Melanie. But it's also been suggested that unconscious bias has also played a role in terms of the disproportionate Black people being affected by the coronavirus. Do you have an opinion on that?
Melanie, do you want to? I mean, I've got a view, but Melanie, do you want to continue?
Sorry, I'm not sure in what respect.
Well, in terms of, as Black people are not getting equal access to treatment, it's been suggested that this has been a contributory factor in terms of the increasing number of deaths within this particular group.
Well, I would hope that that's something that will be picked up in the Public Health England review. But David, do you want to come in if you wanted to?
Yes, I was going to make a wider point about unconscious bias, because I think in relation to many of the issues that we're hearing about and are seeing in the context of COVID, unconscious bias does actually play a role. So as a commission, we really appreciate the significance that conscious and unconscious bias actually has in relation to contributing towards unequal treatment. And this is particularly the case in relation to education and the whole area of unconscious bias training and its impact is something I raised with Ofqual yesterday.
Thanks very much, David and Melanie. They're all my questions.
And when it comes to unconscious bias, does the Commission have any concerns with regard to the development of things like track and tracing apps, where we know that the vast majority of all apps are designed by white men in their early 20s, that there might be any challenge around unconscious bias within those apps?
We do have concerns about that. We talk about those sorts of issues a lot. We talk about how unconscious bias training is important, but actually it's not a universal panacea. Awareness of that kind of bias, I think, is a good starting point. But actually, some of our research has demonstrated that it can be counterproductive too. So I think transparency, which is a theme that's coming through this afternoon, is really important. Awareness is really important, and making people understand what those issues are. My biggest concern often is that it shouldn't result in paralysis, and that would be my concern about overplaying unconscious bias in the development of a tracing app. We need that as soon as possible.
Thank you, David. Can I now bring in Alex Davis-Jones, please?
So, for the uninitiated, unconscious or implicit bias are views and opinions that we hold about people, but are unaware of at a conscious level. In recent years, there has been a growing movement of academics and diversity practitioners promoting the potential relevance of this phenomenon to matters of equality. Proponents argue that if people who don't feel like they discriminate do in fact discriminate, this could explain disparate outcomes for protected groups in an era where so much of the most outrageous and explicit forms of overt and very public discrimination have been eradicated or at least made extremely taboo. The notion that unconscious bias tests can reveal deeply seated prejudice against social groups remains extremely contentious, and many in the psychological community consider their proposed significance to be something of a fad. In my humble subjective opinion, there is certainly more than a whiff of the emperor's new clothes about the way that unconscious bias is talked about in the context of equality. But don't take my word for it, because as the committee's expert witness has just alluded to, recent research by the EHRC found that there is only limited evidence that unconscious bias interventions lead to any actual change, and that they can in fact turn out to be counterproductive. Significantly, some social scientists have observed that one puzzling aspect about ongoing academic and public dialogue about unconscious bias has been the lack of attention paid to the finding that both men and women tend to assign more positive traits to women, and that women in particular display strong evidence of in-group bias. It is, of course, possible that such an oversight could, in and of itself, be an example of unconscious bias. However, based on my experience of documenting glass blind spots, I'd propose that, at least to some extent, explicit bias is at play. For the uninitiated, explicit or conscious bias involve attitudes and beliefs that we have about a particular person or group, very much on a conscious level. People tend to believe that they don't hold prejudiced attitudes, and even when they do consciously acknowledge to themselves that maybe they do, they are still unlikely to publicly disclose explicit prejudiced attitudes, particularly against protected groups. Which brings me to the personal and political priorities of the recently appointed chair of the Women Equaliites Committee, the Conservative MP for Romsey and Southampton North, Caroline Noakes. Beginning with the question she posed to two expert witness academics at the very end of an earlier meeting.
Right at the beginning, you spoke about the Zika outbreak in Brazil, and the response of the Brazilian government didn't include a gendered response to that crisis, notwithstanding the fact that we knew that it was a condition that affected pregnant women specifically. And that led to many women still traditionally having to go out and get food and cooking equipment. So knowing what we do about COVID, that it affects men more than women, should we be thinking about having a gendered response to COVID?
Now, clearly this question does directly allude to the fact that the majority of people in the UK who have died from COVID-19 have in fact been men, that higher male mortality rates have been apparent from very early on in the pandemic, and that by now evidence of this trend has been accumulated from multiple other countries. But it probably won't surprise you to learn that the responses to it almost entirely focused on the ways that women might be most affected. I'll leave a link and timestamp to the full roughly 5-minute segment, but in summary, Professor Marmot, who, as you may recall from a previous video, believes that inequalities are caused by social factors, but men are destined to die younger than women, and that's just the way it is, talks about his concern for women who might experience domestic violence under lockdown, the troubling trend that the life expectancy of working class women is in decline, and the extremely dubious Yvette Cooper-sponsored claim that during a decade of Tory austerity, women took 80% of the financial hit. Meanwhile, Imran Rasool from the Institute of Fiscal Studies mainly talked about pregnant women in Brazil, but I'm pretty sure he was at least alluding to men when pointing to a particularly puzzling problem.
So it's almost as if some people tend to ignore the risks, the health risks that they're subject to. And that's something that comes up repeatedly when we try to study how do people respond to information about health, whether it's that you shouldn't smoke, that you should wash your hands. These are things that everybody knows, but whether they act on that information actually turns out to be quite puzzling, the extent to which people don't. And so those are common findings that we have, and no doubt they're also going to apply to the extent that people are adhering to social distancing information that's provided to them, or other practices that have been suggested.
A puzzling problem which Imran believes may invite a relatively practical solution.
That when it comes to providing information to people, that may need to be targeted, that may need to be tailored. You might need to utilize other evidence in terms of how exactly you try to persuade people and convince them of certain messages.
So in other words, if certain types of people tend to ignore the risks they are subject to by not washing their hands or following social distancing rules, then perhaps we need a more direct or tailored approach to get the message through. And happily, just a few days after this discussion, the chair of the Equalities Committee offered a possible solution when she shared this handy public health related acronym with the world. Now, personally speaking, I choose not to clutch my pearls in exaggerated outrage or pretend that one of Parliament's most prominent current champions of people protected from discrimination was seriously advocating the exclusion or illusion of men in the workplace. But nevertheless, in my humble subjective opinion, I do think that the reaction to the MP's tweet does point towards two very particular things. Firstly, and predictably enough, there was very little reaction indeed. Predictably enough, because in an era when public figures, and MPs in particular, are constantly embroiled in public dramas for saying or being perceived to have said a wrong or inappropriate thing, it remains socially acceptable to publicly speak about men in ways that would rarely be tolerated if directed against any other protected group. Just by way of example, in recent years, numerous neologisms employing man as a derogatory prefix have been embraced by the English dictionary, and in at least one case, even celebrated as Word of the Year. And in 2017, Facebook's moderation practices relating to hate speech came under severe criticism after it was revealed that hundreds of women were having their posts removed because they were describing men as useless, trash, and scum. This led CEO Mark Zuckerberg to criticise his own company's actions and order a review of their approach to censoring so-called hate speech. And secondly, it strikes me as significant that despite the fact that at least around 100 people did complain directly to the MP about a tweet that I assume the EHRC would accept could reasonably be perceived as sexist, Carolyn Noakes didn't feel compelled to so much as justify her thinking and simply ignored her critics. Although she was compelled to mark her recent appointment as chair of the Equality Committee to publicly criticise Boris Johnson for his use of language, stating that it is incumbent on the Prime Minister to think very carefully about what he is saying and the impact it could have on certain communities. That's the same Boris Johnson who last year fired her from her cabinet position in his first week in office, and then briefly ejected her from the Conservative Party entirely after she rebelled against his government's position on Brexit. Which all in all does seem to say something significant about just how seriously Caroline Noakes really feels about discrimination directed at other people, or at the very least, people who happen to be men. Certainly, judging by various gender derogatory comments she's comfortable putting out into the world, including one where she blamed bald men for cutting off her access to a decent haircut. A subject that she has returned to time and time again.
Have you given any consideration to express the view on the focus on which industries and sectors of the economy are returning, and the fact that and everyone believes me to be obsessed with this, but the hair and beauty sector, which employs 83% women in hairdressing and 94% in the beauty industry, looks to be one of the last sectors that is going back, yet construction very early.
She certainly has yet to take any issue whatsoever with the quite extraordinary fact that men are still currently excluded from the remit of the Government Equality Office her committee exists to scrutinise. Mind you, neither, it seems, do the country's leading independent authority on discrimination and human rights law.
Well, we see the Government Equalities Office as having an important leadership role in terms of ensuring that government as a whole is giving proper consideration to equality issues.
Significantly, during her time as Minister for Immigration, Noakes presided over the Tory government's hostile environment policy, so perhaps this is a case of gamekeeper turned poacher, simply to maintain a profile that might help to propel her back onto the front bench. And given the current gender imbalance within her own party, perhaps her strategy is to simply try and shame her way back into a more prestigious position.
I just wanted to know, the Prime Minister commented earlier that he felt there had been enough female voices in the decision-making processes. Why have they not been more visible?
When I said, I don't think I said enough, by the way. I just said that there'd been a lot. I think that it's certainly true that I'd like to have had more female representation in the press conferences so far. We've had Jenny Harries has been mentioned. Priti has done a few. We will do our best, Caroline. And what can I say?
You made the distinction, Prime Minister.
Dido will be appearing this afternoon.
Can I just ask you, how much do you think having women in the room when decisions are being made actually changes the nature of those decisions?
I think you can make a huge difference. To be honest, I mean, that may sound like a vaguely sexist thing to say, but it's very important.
Prime Minister, you made the distinction between there being a lot of women and enough women. How many is enough?
Oh boy, this is that's a question on which I'm not competent to pronounce.
Is it not 50%?
It's not a joking matter, though, is it?
It's not, and all I say, Caroline, is that it's incredibly important to us, as Conservatives, and we have more. 50% would be great. We have large numbers of female MPs of great talent, including yourself, in the House of Commons now, far more than I believe.
You made the point, Prime Minister.
And never forget, it's only the Conservative Party that produced 2 female prime ministers.
Okay, well, we won't start on that.
Maybe you'll be the third.
Thank you very much, Caroline.
Thanks, Bernard.
Typically, Ms Noakes has yet to comment on the current lack of diversity on her own committee. By the way, this exchange took place during the Prime Minister's recent grilling in front of the chairs of all the parliamentary committees. One would hardly have expected Caroline to waste precious time discussing the unequal impact of the virus on men, even with someone who only weeks earlier had himself been in intensive care. But even I was surprised that all 6 of her questions were all about women, given various high-profile concerns that have been raised about disability, older people in care homes, and of course race, to name but a few. One thing that struck me about this particular session was that, access to hairdressers aside, there was very little, if any, scrutiny about the proportionality of the government's quite unprecedented restrictions on all of our human rights, especially given that there will be a direct correlation between those unprecedented restrictions and many of the emerging inequalities under review. For example, the Royal College of Psychiatrists have warned of a mental health tsunami caused by the lockdown. And the Men and Boys Coalition believe it could create a perfect storm of conditions, leading to a dramatic increase in the number of people driven to suicide. And as the government quietly winds down the scheme to get everyone in, various factors and forecasts lead to fears that the number of rough sleepers on our streets will have risen significantly by the end of the year. But just to end on a more glass half full perspective, I'm going to leave the last word to the Equality and Human Rights Commission's Chief Commissioner and suggest that one of the fundamental principles of an effective and ethical approach to championing matters of equality is understanding and embracing the radical notion that people like him are people with protected characteristics too.
And our overall concern as Commission is that however difficult crisis management is, when we build back, we need to build back better, and actually equality considerations need to be centre stage. I was at a meeting this morning where technology change was being discussed, and apparently there's been more technology change in the last 2 months than in the last 10 years. And it occurred to me, if technology change, which we all now depend upon, can happen that quickly, why can't we accelerate discussions about equality considerations? Because I think we all know that the pandemic has unearthed real inequalities that exist. And to quote Rishi Sunak, our Chancellor, he was talking very powerfully on the economic response to the pandemic by saying we all depend upon each other. And I've been using that statement a lot because I think, A, it's true, but B, it couldn't be more true in relation to how we respond from an equality and human point of view to the pandemic and how we build for the future. So my plea is we do need to take these equality considerations into account, and they should be centre stage rather than optional in relation to how we actually move out of lockdown, how we ease the situation, and we provide for everybody as we deal with the longer term consequences of the virus.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.